Hopefully you can stay with us for a while. We have persons out of Washington and New York who have come to join us at this event. And of course we have Dr. Peter Phillips, former Minister of National Security, and of other things, but I think in this context we'll stick to national security and probably former Minister of Finance as the two that are most significant in this context. Other members of the diplomatic corps, other public officials, of course our moderators and panelists who are here with us today and will be sharing with us over the next couple of days. Other specially invited guests, members of the media, and of course the persons who are joining us online. Ladies and gentlemen, good morning to everyone. I'm certainly happy to have this opportunity to share a few remarks and to sit on one of the panels to discuss this whole business of violence. And interestingly, the business of not just violent crime, but also criminal violence. It's interesting how that's phrased and framed. You can tell that there are some academics in the room and some thought that went behind that to craft these topics for the 9 panels that will be on over the next 2 days. And I think they address probably each aspect and every aspect of this whole business of crime and violence, both here and in the United States. And of course, there is a nexus between what happens here and there, because we have a large diaspora. And of course, for years, for many years, we've enjoyed a great partnership with U.S. law enforcement, from a law enforcement perspective, but of course, significant government to government relationships over that period. So this violence, and it's interesting, so there have been some discussions around the business of violence and violence being a sort of an epidemic here, and epidemiological view of violence has been raised as something that has been discussed many times. But I don't think the appreciation for what an epidemic is was as clearly appreciated 2 or 3 years ago as it is today, as the world went through the impact of a health pandemic or epidemic. So what this has done is given us an opportunity to move that idea of an epidemic or pandemic of violence into something very real for us. And so when we start to consider how you deal with one of those, then a number of things arise now that perhaps wouldn't have arisen before or even be considered palatable. But we did it around COVID-19. So that's just a thought that I'm going to leave out there. Obviously, the collection of persons who are going to be involved over the next 2 days and the different perspectives, looking through the panelists, we should get a really rich discourse around this business of violence, and hopefully, as Dr. Ronaldo had said, we will get some ideas of the way forward, but also a better sense of what is actually being done. And the idea that even when you come to the problem from different positions, different points of view, they're not mutually exclusive usually. And perhaps the solutions that we seek lie not in which one of the approaches we should take, but how do we combine these approaches to get the best possible outcome. because there is really, and it's interesting when you've been in the business for a while, as I have been. I don't think there is an approach that somebody has come up with that they can't point to something and say, see, it worked for a while. And we start to look at the analysis, and the capture of data allows us to analyze why it worked and why did it work for a time. And how do we join these things together in an effective way of ensuring that it works and works permanently. Now clearly, security and citizen security, national security is not just the business, especially when you start to talk about national security, it's not just the business of a security ministry. And our safety and citizen security is not just the business of a police force, but the police force is a major actor in ensuring that that happens. And so we will have some more discussions about that, I'm sure, over the next couple of days. Obviously, as was said if you've looked at the programs in the foreword that was written by Dr. Ortiz, and they speak about some of the statistics around Jamaica being certainly at the moment the second highest rate of homicides in the world. I think we've been in the top 5 for the last 20 years or so. And it was interesting that, and reasonable, but broadly consistent with the trends of the past 5 years. I suggest that the trends we see have been those of the last 20+ years. In 1997, we crossed the Rubicon of 1,000 of our citizens being killed intentionally in 1 year. And that does not include police or state shootings, just from criminal violence. And when you have a situation where 1,000 when you cross that Rubicon, you set a new bar almost. Since then, we dipped below right afterwards, just for about a year or two, and then we've consistently, for 20+ years, been above that level. But I don't know that we've ever really treated it as with the sort of concern that you should have for that level of violence. And so we have a chronic situation. Every now and again it seems to be acute, but once you look at history, once you look at time and what has happened, we've been consistently above for 20 years. We need to do something different. I come from the position of a practitioner in one sense, but also somebody who's done some studies in the field. As a practitioner, near 40 years ago, I was a young military officer going out on patrols to assist the police force. And interestingly enough, 40 years later, the youngster coming in, the young officer coming in, is on patrol, assisting the police in the same areas. Now, there's something, and I think everybody in the room, perhaps, and sorry if I'm only speaking about Jamaica, because I know we have US colleagues here, but our reality is that we can't afford, in my view, that 40 years hence, we are still having this conversation. We need to have a different one. We need some different threats, not the same old ones. Different challenges as a country, not the same old challenges. And so there are not many fora where we can have this kind of discussion. And so I'm certainly looking forward to having this discussion. And I want to thank Ambassador Perry for supporting this and creating, putting your weight behind having this have just families, not just families here in Jamaica, but also in the Jamaican diaspora and others in the United States. We are very concerned about crime. It's especially criminal activity that contributes to a very high, more than alarming murder rate. Jamaica is a very solid, strong partner, and the U.S. Embassy has partnered with Jamaica throughout its 60 years of independence. The United States was one of the first countries to establish diplomatic ties with the government of Jamaica. Since then, we have supported and worked together on technical, bilateral, and global issues of mutual concern. The Fulbright program is one such way we collaborate with Jamaica. And today's symposium is a direct result of the Fulbright exchange program, as well as federal support of assistance for this event. As U.S. Ambassador to Jamaica, it is my pleasure to be here today. This symposium is the brainchild of U.S. Fulbright scholar Dr. Reynaldo Ortiz Minaya. Did I say that right? I'm working on my Spanish. Who is affiliated with the Institute of Criminology at the University of the West Indies, Mona. The concept of such a symposium was deemed timely to the policy discussions on the matter of security and crime experienced by both Jamaica and the United States. We thank each of you in advance as panelists, as attendees and participants, in whatever capacity, for your time and contributions in making this event successful. Security is a multifaceted area of concern. On this occasion, we are focused on the state agents of the state's interactions with average citizens and those institutions that provide checks and balances in the system. As a diplomatic mission, our efforts have been technical and resource-focused. For example, we have provided speedboats, lab equipment, and specialized training for investigators, prosecutors, and judges, to name a few of our direct collaborations. In the past year alone, our International Narcotics and Law Enforcement section has assisted the JCF to address police corruption through the anti-corruption policies and strategies. INL has supported the JCF polygraph unit since its inception in 2016 and has provided over $600,000 in support, to include the recent refurbishment of an office space to house that unit. And I was very pleased to have participated in the handover ceremony just a few weeks ago. Similarly, the JDF has partnered with the United States military and begun training exercises with the JDF Civil Activities Regiment to ensure that the JDF has the capacity to conduct special operations to protect Jamaican citizens and keep Jamaica secure for American citizens who live here and who travel here to enjoy the great beaches and the warm climate. I understand that at least two very talented members of my embassy team, Dolan Greenidge from the Drug Enforcement Administration and Dominic Riley from the United States Postal Inspection Service will be participating in a panel today or tomorrow. And I'm looking forward to hearing very positive reports about the discussion that they will be involved in. Fundamentally, Jamaicans and Americans agree that security is not only a big deal, but it's big and broad. Let us explore ways to promote positive citizen experiences, effective operations, and solution-oriented policies. During the 2 days we will be here, I'm sure that look forward to the benefits that we will obtain, and that your participation will help find a solution or point us towards the road to solving the problem of extremely high violence and death rate by murder and other criminal activity in this very normally peaceful island nation. Thank you, and enjoy the symposium.
Thank you, Ambassador, for your comments, and Major General Anderson as well. Before we proceed to panel one, I'd like to also honor the presence of Ms. Deanna Logan, who represents the City of New York, the Department of Criminal Justice. At this moment, we're going to transition to panel one. So I would like to invite the moderator, Ms. Joanna Callan, please.
Good morning, everyone. I'm going to ask the first group of panelists, Major General Anthony Anderson, Dr. Honorable Peter Phillips, Dr. Jason Mackay, Lloyd Distance, and Alexander Coswell to join me on stage, please. Each panelist is going to have a 7 to 10 minute presentation, after which we will open up the floor for the question and answer session. So just to make sure we're all on the same page, we're doing panel one, which is from crime to violence, from criminals to violence producers, the discursive and policy shift towards national and citizen security. I'm going to start on my left with Major General Anderson and just work the way down the line. So Major General Anderson, please.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Joanna, and good morning again to everyone. So, looking at the topic, there are a couple of aspects to it, and I'm going to just quickly run through perhaps 3 of them, and I'm going to start at the policy level. And since it spoke about a policy shift, and the nature of the policy shift, let me start there. So I think one of the largest shifts that I've seen in policy in recent times was the movement of security sort of from the periphery or from the margins to the center of government and government attention. And what I mean by that is, and I'll just carry back in a little bit of history quickly. In 2016, November, Jamaica entered an IMF standby agreement, which was a follow-on from a series of IMF support agreements that had taken place over the previous few years. So at that point in 2016, we moved to an IMF standby agreement. And for the first time, I think for the IMF and also for us, included in the benchmarks for this IMF agreement were actually citizen security benchmarks. Very unusual for what is largely a financial arrangement, and you're talking about debt to GDP, wage bills, and that sort of thing. But all of a sudden, we have security benchmarks in an IMF agreement. What that did, by putting it in there, was to recognize, even though it had been spoken about, but recognize in a tangible way that security is central to development and to meeting your development goals and your national goals. And that's a tangible response to that. Now, once you do that, then, and you move security to the center, it is no longer just the business of a minister who has a budget in national security to try and do and fix everything. It now moves from there to where it becomes a national and certainly a government responsibility. And so the interest in security changes. Now, once you start to look at it in that way, even though for years, as was discussed earlier, you have a human tragedy of people being killed and so on, and it impacts. But it also impacts a significant portion of your GDP. And what that means is that you move from the security as an expense to security as an investment. And that's a shift. So the security of people, not only do you get to address the human tragedy of insecurity, but you can start to address some of the economic and developmental concerns in the country. And I think that was a major shift. It meant that once you do that, all of a sudden, a number of things become fundable and become funded to start to build the capacity of not just law enforcement, but how you secure a country. And so you're talking about a multi-ministry approach, because you start to think about how you secure sectors and how you guard against shocks. And this was a discussion that was taking place without any thought of a COVID-19 pandemic. There was no thought of that. But right at that time, you're saying that it has to be broader. So what flowed from that was a plan called Plan Secure Jamaica. And Plan Secure Jamaica looked at those sectors that needed to be secure and allowed us to create a national plan that was in place and is in place. From that flows, as a subset of that now, is nested, of course, in the Ministry of National Security's plans, but also the other ministerial plans that are put together. Then if you keep going down the line, and then of course, then the national plan for the police has to now fit into a wider context. And because the strategic into 18, 19, and by early 2020 we were in a pandemic, and that kind of slowed things up a bit. So those from the law enforcement, and because here's where we start to get into impacts on crime and violence. And as I say, I have to be very quick. So, but I'm trying to show the nesting. So from the law enforcement perspective, of course, then the plans that we put in place for the policing plans that now go right down to the level of what happens at a division and at a station. And in the discussions, obviously coming down, and in the discussions, the whole idea of police reform that has been on the table for years, being discussed, is now in a position to be resourced. The nature of it, though, is that you are coming out of a hole, and you're building up, and then you're going to come out to the ground and start building the capacity. And largely we do it in three directions. One is how we deal with the law enforcement matters that face us today. And so you create greater agility and response, much greater use of science and technology in investigations, increasing your investigative capacity and so on, and you build out that. And then you have your whole transformation program, largely on 5 things. Your people, recruitment, training, continual training, and so on. Your structures, how the force is organized given current realities. Infrastructure, which is a key to delivering the kind of service you want to people. Then you're talking about our technology and our equipment and how that works together to deliver better outcomes. And of course, is the business of service delivery and how we deliver better service. And so, for instance, pursuing ISO 9001 certification on service delivery and so on is just a part of it. Now, each one of these areas have specific plans that are being worked through as the capacity of the organization, its agility, and its ability to respond improves. However, one of the things that has been absent from most discussions about, and I'm coming down to the police level now, is what is the legitimate capacity of a police force. In other words, what is it that they are expected to do with the resources they have? Now, some of our academics who have commented on it have said that you will find an investigator in Jamaica with 20 to 40 times the caseload of an investigator in some of the jurisdictions that we try to pattern ourselves off of. That has an impact. And the question is, and I'll probably stop here because I've been going on too long. The question is, if that is the case, do we build 20 times the capacity, or do we do other things to reduce the input? I'll just leave it here.
Thank you very much. Dr. Peter Phillips.
Thank you very much. The starting point that I take is, I think that we have to recognize that increasing levels of crime and violence has been one of the major deficits in our experience as an independent country since some 60 years ago. And indeed, the continuation of current levels of criminal violence threatens to derail the entire independence project. It constitutes a major threat to our developmental capabilities. I shall try here to call both upon my past experience as would-be academic, I should say, some of which, for better or worse, was supported by Fulbright LASPA program, which would be probably before you were born. But appreciated nonetheless, and at UWI, and also try to call upon my practical encounters with the problem of national security during my stint as Minister of National Security. An important starting point, though often not accepted and grasped fully, is the fact that violence is in fact endemic to our national culture, has very deep roots in plantation slavery and the behavioral patterns which emerged from that. Throughout our history, I think one can say that almost all social relationships in all critical national institutions have been mediated by violence to a significant degree. At the workplace, the plantation, as all the literature tells us, Thistlewood Diaries and the like, was a place of unrelenting violence from sunup till sundown, imposed by those who were in control upon those who were the controlled. And that pattern of overarching violence also was present in the family, with a lot of child-rearing practices dominated by violence in schools. I think anybody who went to a school anywhere before 1980 can attest to that. Certainly where I went to school, I mean, caning and beating was a omnipresent reality. In the criminal justice system, punishments until probably the mid-70s included the application of lashes. And the only point I make is that it has created a society in which violent solutions to disputes and problems are accepted and indeed often commonplace. Interpersonal conflicts get resolved by violence, school infractions, the disciplining of children. It forms one might say, a substratum of the overall problem that we have, and implies that any solution is going to involve cultural transformation to a considerable degree. Over the past 60 years, violence and criminality has been transformed, one might say, from one of relatively low levels, certainly on par with the rest of the Caribbean and the rest of the region and the world, to one where our levels of violence and criminal violence have become among the highest in the world, certainly as measured by homicides, and where crime has become less a matter of one might say, social dysfunctionality, individual dysfunctional behaviors, and more one where centered upon organized crime and criminal enterprise. That is to say, enterprise is driven by the need to accumulate profit like any other enterprise, yet their activities are fundamentally illegal activities. The activities that form the focus of these enterprises are essentially illegal activities. So I look at the post-independence period as consisting three main phases. The first, which extends, and I don't think one should take the timelines or the temporal distinctions as being precise or exact. There's overlap, of course, but a period of relatively low levels of homicides extending from where you had about 6 to 10 per 100,000, extending from around 1962 to the mid-70s, 64 thereabouts, where, as I said, crime was generally a matter of individual excess social dysfunctionality and social protest that occurred in the period. There were the so-called riots of 1965, the so-called anti-Chinese riots, the Black Power riots of 1968. There were bank robberies that were kind of organized in the name of social protest, really. And that phase, however, was overtaken in the mid-70s and a period extending through to the mid-80s by another pattern dominated by the gun at this point in time and dominated by political competition and social conflicts between communities falling within the ambit of different political parties. But the gun, while it emerged as the dominant weapon of criminal activity, used in criminal activity, was still not as generalized in its distribution as it is now. The third phase, extending from the end of the 80s to the present time, I think has become increasingly dominated by organized crime. And organized crime, which in reality, and one might almost say of necessity, has international dimensions to it, because it involves trading of commodities or services, and often with other jurisdictions, and the securing of resources, whether human or material, guns, ammunition, accounting services, and the like, from others, technical assistance in training of would-be militias and other criminals. The earlier phase was driven primarily by drug running, marijuana export, and cocaine transshipment. By about in the early part of the century, Jamaica, according to figures from the United Nations Drug Control Program, Jamaica was accounting for about 20% of all the cocaine transshipped from Colombia was transshipped through Jamaican waters or land territory. Efforts made by Jamaica and its international partners seriously reduced this, put a dent in that trade, and caused much of it to move offshore and into other nearby jurisdictions in Central America, Haiti, and elsewhere. But ironically, in a sense, it also generated an upsurge. The collapse of the cocaine generated an upsurge in criminal activity in Jamaica as the criminal organizations competed more emphatically for space and territory and income. And they branched out into other activities, other illicit activities, including murder for hire, extortion, scamming, and other dimensions of cybercrime, gun importation, and the like. The gun became the main instrument of violence, including machine guns, strangely because with the migrations as they continued to the United States in particular, you found this phenomenon where more and more gun running was not centrally controlled, but was more dispersed among all kinds of groups and widely distributed among communities. So some of the relevant features of this phase, which I am asserting is still typical of the current phase, is one, we need to grasp that the resources at play here are massive resources. I think oftentimes the country and many involved don't grasp how massive these resources are. And I am going back decades even, but we were able to trace millions of pounds coming into one community in Kingston because of from groups operating in the UK in collaboration with these groups. Those resources are used to purchase properties, purchase weapons, vehicles, and the like. But in turn, because of the massive resources, it helped reinforce a pattern of excessively violent behavior. And the reasons are not too complex to understand. Simply put, if you steal $2 million worth of cocaine from somebody, he can't go to the police and say, somebody has stolen my cocaine. So he has to impose his own deterrent. And that deterrent often involved not just identifying and killing those who stole the cocaine, but killing in order to deter anybody who had an idea, killing anybody associated with them. So you would see a murder somewhere up in the hills of Manchester of an old woman, but her only crime was that she was a relative of someone who was viewed by one of these criminals as having wronged them in some sort of way. So that pattern of excessive and demonstrative violence became even more embedded in this society. And this has generated and reinforced a culture of violence, which I think is at play in many communities. And much of what the JCF has to deal with currently is this pattern more usually associated with scamming this time rather than drugs, where people feel the need to undertake excessive violence, not just against individuals, but against the community against which put up or from which their opponents come. The fourth point, I think, in this current phase that needs to be also understood is that these tremendous resources available to criminal enterprises have been widely used and continue to be widely used to corrupt officials and institutions. And a wide array of institutions and officials, from political parties, the churches, civil service institutions, security forces, court systems at various levels, and the like. So you now have, alongside a culture of violence, you have a mutually reinforcing culture of corruption, which has taken root in the country. Now, without going into any particular order of precedence, I think there are some signposts based upon experience as to how to get back to law-abiding civil society. I think we have to accept, and I want to reinforce a point made by Tony Anderson here, that we have to recognize that it will involve a whole of society effort. It's going to involve getting all the institutions of the society, the school system, court system, civil service, land titling, and all the rest of it to be joining in a united, coordinated effort. It's going to involve also a significant cultural revolution, an overused phrase and often with different kinds of meanings to different people. But it really will involve that. If you listen to a lot of what is portrayed in some of our music, and that is just sheer support for violence and violent behavior. And somehow we have to reverse those tendencies, because they encourage the view that says that even simple disputes within a family need to be resolved violently. So we're going to have to reorient these behaviors. It's going to involve our schools, family outreach. It is also going to involve straight community outreach. This is what was attempted with the Peace Management Initiative, to allow for some entity to reach directly to persons who are involved in much of this violence, personal violence. Not often convenient, wasn't at all viewed as convenient that the security forces should be leading this, but somehow you have to resolve some of these disputes other than by the sheer shedding of blood. And that means that there has to be some outreach. There needs also to be specific reform at the level of the security forces. Again, the Commissioner spoke to much of that. The culture of corruption has to be addressed. And let me say, probably shouldn't, but I say it anyway, that corruption doesn't affect only the junior ranks in the JDF and in the JCF. And unless the anti-corruption efforts are going to address the problem at all the levels, it won't have credibility, even in the force itself. And that's a problem that efforts have been made to address it in the past, but it needs to be much more sustained.
Sorry, Dr. Phillips, I'm going to ask you to wrap up 30 seconds.
In less than 10. Competence in investigations and prosecutions, I think there has to be much closer integration between the prosecutorial elements and the investigative elements than is currently the case. It was tried in some of the groups antecedent to MOCA. And again, we have to have an integration with all the other anti-corruption agencies, including MOCA, Integrity Commission, and the like. But there's much more, but most of all, it will require the engagement of all the institutions alongside the JCF in the society. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Dr. Mackay?
Good morning. Am I on now? All right, good morning, everybody. Well, seeing as we have a very rigidly enforced 10-minute rule, I'm going to spend less time explaining to you that we actually do have a significant increase in violence in an environment where there's a reduction in crime, because I think that is something that is understood by everybody. I think I have a slideshow here, but it's not there. There it is. Okay. All right. Well, my presentation is, why is there an increase of violent activity in an environment of reduced crime? And is there a short-term solution? Why and how that, we can change culture. Although we have to. They want to hear that we have a short-term solution to be done now. Very impractical. But any short-term solution has to morph into a medium and long-term solution in some respects. And as it was as has been said by this panel already, cultural change is important and it doesn't happen in the short term. But I think right now we have to look on, can we find a short-term solution that at least starts the ball rolling to a medium and long-term solution. So, that being said, violence in Jamaica is to a large degree committed by gangs. Gangs that are financed by a number of areas, but to a large degree by persons who live overseas, who are sending down money, sending down resources, sending down guns, and sending down the stimulation to cause the conflicts. There is, of course, the extortion rackets that major gangs are involved in, but more minor gangs have started to be involved in. It used to be a Spanish town and downtown thing 20 years ago, 15 years ago. Now, it has become, it's developing into a thing that's happening into smaller districts in St. Catherine in particular. But you never really had that because these people who are operating these shops simply don't have the income to finance a true extortion racket. But that has now crept into the whole thing. But in essence, the murders are committed largely by this group. Now, it may seem like this group is not large, but if you think about custody of 4,000 people that largely are gang members and active, and I've heard various figures knocked around, by me too, that we have about 10,000 active gang members around us. It's still a very large amount of people involved in gang activity. Now, am I gone again? All right. The gangs exist in Jamaica because of political history, poverty, and culture, among a few other factors. But these are the three areas that really make why our gangs are, I guess for want of a better word, more destructive, more dominant, and probably better at what they do than many other gangs. We have had a negative political history that I'd like to think is not really a big factor now. It has developed into culture, and this culture is become more of a culture of violence than a culture of crime, which is exactly what's happening here now. You have an environment where major crimes are reducing, but murder is increasing. The reality is that although we look on murder as our benchmark for almost everything, it has so much variables to it that it doesn't really make a lot of sense using murder in isolation. You see, when a violent, extremely violent act has been committed, there are so many factors that determine whether it ends in a homicide. It can largely be because of a good hospital service. It can be because the ability to transport people for medical care. It can be that you have particularly skilled assassins or lousy. It depends on a number of factors. So, using murder as the benchmark is one of the big blunders we make. I like to look at it more as an extreme violent event. And if we perhaps start to measure that statistic, then we could look on the impact of law enforcement better on how we are actually controlling crime. Don't look on the murder in isolation. Look on the shootings, look on the stabbings, look on the attempted murders, and then compile that figure as extreme violent events, and you can compare one year to that a little bit better. But most crimes are committed by gangs, and one would ask, why is it that while crime is reducing, murders are still going up? And it's actually a lot simpler than I think from a tactical or a less technical standpoint, for want of a better word. It's simply because the lack of police control over gang-dominated territories. It's really that simple. You see, for somebody within a garrison, for want of a better word, a squatter settlement, he doesn't have to go very far to commit murder or to commit a shooting or so. Now, if he's going to commit a crime, a robbery, he usually has to leave where he is to do it. So, where the actual gangs are in residence, normally the police don't have that type of hour-to-hour control over it. No, so you'll have a strong police presence in Half-Way, and it in some ways may be able to reduce robberies. But then if you go into the parts of Maxfield Avenue, you don't and simply can't have the type of police presence in these communities that would stop a guy simply traversing a couple of zinc fences and killing somebody else. It just doesn't exist. So to prevent this, you require the occupation of gang control zones, which cannot be provided by Jamaica's law enforcement apparatus at this point. We just don't have the numbers for it, and we simply can't afford it. Now, there is also a crisis as in relation to labor generally now, and this is something that is new, but high school graduates are not available for recruitment into the JCF, the JDF, security companies in the way that they previously were because of the BPOs, call centers, and immigration, more university opportunities. A number of factors have made a shortage of labor available to law enforcement agencies. So this is really where I want to morph into establishment of a JCF reserve, and this is my short-term solution that I alluded to earlier. I'd like it to be modeled off the JDF in respect of required training. There is reserves. JDF, as you know, has an active reserve, and there is no differentiation in any real way between the required training of a full-time JDF soldier to a reserve JDF soldier, nor is there any separation or distinction between the full-time and auxiliary in respect to recognition of ranks and so on. So what I'm looking on is a similar situation between the JCF, with the JCF that mirrors the JDF. If you don't have this occupation that I speak of, we could strategize all we want. It's that simple. If you don't have the men on the ground to stop very impractical and well-armed young men from crossing the road to kill somebody, then they're going to continue killing somebody. And in order to do that, we have to have a target size of about 20,000 persons who make themselves available 8 hours a week each, 14 days a year, and 1 weekend per month. If you look on this type of time outlay, then you're looking at what would basically convert to a full-time force, auxiliary force of about 5,000, but because it's 20,000 persons giving part-time, it gives the JCF underground about a capacity of about 5,000 more if you were to measure it against full-time. The training is the current 8 weeks training given to district constables in modules conducted over 6 months. So with remote education as we now have it and so on, a lot of the things that we have to teach at the training school, we can now teach remotely other than, fieldcraft, firearms and that type of thing. But currently, the district constables go through about 8 weeks of training. What we want is some way for that to become some degree of it to be remote and some degree of it to be within the training school. But this 8-week period is what would convert a citizen to a police officer. And really and truly, that's what divides the two. You go through your training, you swear an oath, and you are a police officer. This is why persons who work with MOCA, who may not be JCF members by the time the transformation is complete, are still very much law enforcement. And if you look on the United States models, you have various aspects of law enforcement that doesn't fall necessarily under a centralized police station, U.S. Marshals, Customs, Immigration. They're, in many ways, law enforcement is just the same. There's a legislative framework that is provided by the District Constables Act. It's already there and has been there for think about the early to mid 18th century. It exists now. Currently, the district constabulary employs about 2,000 full-time persons with 1 and 2 part-time, but really and truly it's a 40-hour-week job. It's now pensionable. However, there's some problems that came with that in the sense that once they made it a full-time organization, then you can have little or no auxiliary participation. The reality is that it doesn't pay very much, so it's going to be very difficult for you to get persons to give 40 hours a week who have a full-time, who are able to give you that in a full-time situation. Simply doesn't exist. So what you have done is effectively cut up the reserve, the auxiliary portion of the citizenry to get involved in policing. If the JDF did what was done by creating this to be a 40-hour mandatory, then what would have happened is that they would have no reserve. And the reserve is a very important part of the JDF's ability to respond. So this increase of numbers allows for occupation as part-time district constables. Basically, they can perform the duties currently being carried out by full-time members, making full-time members available for occupational duties, and they themselves can participate in the occupation themselves. The legal framework, as I said earlier, is already there. It doesn't require that much alteration. Other than a few years ago, the district constables started to fall under the Civil Servants Act. This was to allow for pensions. And this is very important because you have thousands of persons there working who need a pension and have worked hard for a pension. What I'm suggesting is that there could be some alteration that allows for part-time duties as it previously did, and this is how it worked for many years. So it has to be two-pronged. If it's single-pronged in any way, if it's single-pronged then it's only full-time, then it disallows participation from the majority of the country. If it only allows for part-time, then you cut persons who are no pensionable out of their pension. So this really is an adjustment of a law and a policy within the JCF to make this happen. Nothing else will result in a statistical reduction in murders. And in the short term, I mean, I'm a big proponent on social change and adapting culture by changes in the social structure of inner cities, in improving infrastructure. But I'm here to talk on a short-term solution. I can give you an extremely long presentation on a medium and a long-term solution too. But because this particular topic is dealing with short-term, I'm going to be quite frank with you. No matter what you do, even if we should increase the capacity of investigators by another 1,000, we're going to significantly impact the statistic. We're going to have persons in the space which are currently dominated by gangs.
Dr. McCay, I'm going to ask you to...
You see I was dead on. All right. Thank you for having me.
Thank you, Dr. McCay. Before we go any further, I'm just going to ask persons to put their cell phones on silent so they don't interrupt the panelists, please. Thank you. Mr. Distant.
Thank you. Thank you, Joanna. Fellow panelists, ladies and gentlemen, good morning. And with all protocols being observed, I will just sort of talk through a couple of share with the thought process that went into the national consensus on crime. And the title that we're talking about this morning, violent crime, and difference between crime versus violence and criminals versus violence producers. As we discussed the primary driver, which was to get all of Jamaica, civil society, government, opposition, aligned on how we fight crime, in the course of the discussion, what came out from some of the academics that were within the group was, and as well as the other stakeholders in the group, was that in itself we have crime as one component, but there are bigger issues, or certainly more impactful issues, surrounding violence and corruption. And as we spoke about the target, which was about a sustainable reduction in crime, it became a sustainable reduction in crime, violence, and corruption. So violence and corruption are crimes within them, but we found it necessary and important to expand the focal point of the objective to identify violence and corruption as two components that we needed specific attention from all of Jamaica first to attain that sustainable reduction that we wanted to achieve. The consensus itself and the thought behind it, and I smiled as Commissioner Anderson was making his earlier presentation this morning when he said national security is not for the Ministry of National Security to solve by itself. Citizen security is not a JCF issue to itself. There's a very clear requirement, objective understanding that all of Jamaica needed to rally behind a particular set of initiatives, programs, activities for us to attain this sustainable reduction. Just around that time, the former Minister of National Security, leader of opposition at the time, we'll all recall there were a lot of discussion around states of emergencies and also. So this is 2018 going into 2019, going into 2020. And the discussion around the clear hold and build strategy came very much to the forefront of how does the police operate, the issue of capacity, the issue of utilization of the military. And again, one of the academics pointed out in the course of the discussions that we realize that when you use the term clear in the context that we're using it, it's actually counter-insurgency language. Is that something that is sustainable? Well, we certainly don't believe it is. I don't believe anybody believes that approach in itself is sustainable and will deliver for us a sustainable reduction in crime. We reverted to looking at Plan Secure Jamaica as well, and all the key and important elements, most of the key and important elements to achieve a reduction in crime were embodied in that document as well. But as we took a look at it, we believe that there are some important components that were not highlighted enough or pulled out in such a way that if we're going to get all of Jamaica on board, that people will actually jump and come together to make this reality. And the discourse that says most Jamaicans are just focused on what we see in the media, the number of murders. Right? So it's about violence. That's what we see in the media, and we coin and contextualize that as being the problem, the embodiment of the crime problem in Jamaica. And if once you start to think like that, then the only thing that comes to your mind is a view that there's this criminal justice ecosystem. The responsibility of the Jamaica Constabulary Force to find persons and send them to the justice system, the responsibility of the justice system to incarcerate them, and the responsibility of the Department of Correctional Services to house and hold these criminals that we want to get out of society. And when you focus your thoughts along the lines of that criminal justice ecosystem, what you begin to lose is the fact that this does not solve the deeper issues, the longer term issues that have become what I'd call what we all speak about in terms of the cultural, the social, the community, the urban blight. We have to think about what happens with the squatter communities and urban redevelopment that needs to take place. And of course, this focal conversation that we eventually pulled out around victimization. When we look at crime, the two biggest buckets are gang-on-gang crime, or let me say gang-on-gang crime, probably about in the region of 76, 78%. I don't know what the exact figures are now. And then we have this whole statistic around domestic violence, and whether this is gender-based violence, violence against children, violence against the aged. So when we look at what drives that term victimization, again, gender-based and violence against children, this is not an endemic to the gang operations themselves. This is largely a cultural issue. We say the way to discipline the child is giving a big hit, but then when you hit that person, you yourself are producing violence. So I don't know if you start to call anybody, or certainly we should consider anybody within the domestic violence context, inflicting violence on another as a violence producer. But what they're also doing is reinforcing for that next generation that this is acceptable going forward. And so for us to get to that sustainable reduction, we all can envision, and certainly all have accepted, that getting that social, cultural, community transformation, how we engage, how we deal with parenting, how we as a community parent or become that village that we've all sought to be or that we all speak about, becomes very important. So we take that transitional step that says, okay, we need to get all of Jamaica behind this. But for us to get all of Jamaica behind this, we all need to come to a common definition and common understanding of what the issue is and how we solve it. So it's very often, if you go to an African on the street, you'll hear very different comments around what will solve this crime problem. I recall, and I'll call out the private sector, I'm from the private sector. I recall a private sector leader saying, forget everything else you're doing. If you deal with theft of electricity, we will solve this crime problem in Jamaica. And we laugh, it certainly sounded ludicrous, but that was what is in that person's head, and he was very vociferous around that being the solution. Until we get all of Jamaica to rally together to provide a consistent view of these are the things that we're going to do, and even if it's about embracing the short term, whilst we enact some of the cultural, some of the social and community transformation activities, it's about understanding that this problem we have did not take place overnight. It's a 40, 50-year problem. It's going to take us some time. Some people say it's a generation or two to solve. Nobody wants to hear that either. But for us to actually begin the process, we've got to start somewhere. The government, the opposition, I believe, did a great service to Jamaica when they got together and said, here are the things that we're going to come together and agree to sustain over an extended period. And it's just for us as the citizenry to get behind it and to hold them accountable for delivering on these things. So, I will pause and sharing right there, and we can move on.
Thank you, Mr. Distant. Mr. Coswell?
Sorry. As a crime of violence, whether it's one. It's understandable because during that time, they were pretty, not most tumultuous here Jamaica has seen, but pretty bad in terms of both category 1 crimes. Well, category 1 crimes include murders and shootings, but also burglaries, larcenies, a range of other phenomena. And in 2005, I think I recall that, I think that says that Jamaica was number 3 in the world in terms of violent death. That year, the only countries that beat us was by a little bit El Salvador, because they had a particularly bad year, and Iraq, which was going through a war. And so it's understandable that during this period, and from before, people developed all these, what I like to call folk theories about what the causes of both crime and violence in Jamaica. Lots of these folk theories include poor nutrition, a crisis of mental health across the country. My personal favorite is we descend from particularly rebellious or violent people, and that's what makes Jamaica stand out in terms of Africa. Also, things like lack of opportunity, inequality, a range of other things. I mean, not a new one, it's new, but I put in the knowledge of some of my favorite folk theories. But with these, there's 3 main problems with this way of looking at, with these folk theories and the way of looking at crime and violence together as one. One is that Jamaica, as I've pointed out, is an outlier in murder, and none of these folk theories explain why. because you can point to a range, a whole lot of other countries that suffer from the same kind of problems and more, and are much poorer and have much worse mental health issues and have much poorer nutrition, and they do not have the same levels of murder that we experience.
Sorry, Alex, you can just move closer to the mic, please. I think some of the members of the audience are having a problem hearing you.
Oh, I'm sorry. Sorry. Another problem with which Dr. Mackay alluded to is the divergence in crime and violence that we've seen over the last 10 to 12 years. Now, I wish he had included, and if I had known, I would have included the graph to show you the Category 1 crimes since around 2010 to show you. It's actually pretty fascinating and striking, because all Category 1 crimes, except for murder and shooting, have trended downwards year upon year since about 2010. And murders and shootings, which you may categorize as violence. I like to use the term homicidal behavior. It has stayed almost constant with various dips and flows, but always above 1,000 murders per year. So placing crime and violence in one category does not make sense in that context. It does not explain that divergence. The third problem is a lot of these folk theories that have the underlying assumption of irrationality. That the murders are a result of people being hot-headed. They're not thinking about their decisions. They can't think of a better way to solve their disputes or problems. They're just reacting, and I don't think there's any evidence for that our murder problem is a result of broad irrationality. That view still holds in other places, and I think that's why you have a lot of social interventions over the past few decades have been geared towards trying to help people in particular violent communities to figure out a better way to solve their issues. A lot of people recommended cognitive behavioral therapy as a panacea to solve our violent problems, as if, again, the assumption is irrationality on behalf of murders. Now, I'd like to put it to you that our murder problem is not as a result of irrationality or any of these other folk issues. Murder, there's a logic to the violence in Jamaica. As Dr. Mackay pointed out again, we have a murder problem because we have a gang problem. I think the JCS statistics say about 80% of murders committed in Jamaica every year are committed by gangs. And they're not committed just out of gangs, just killing for the sake of it. Gangs have reasons that they commit it. They're trying to deter violence, they're trying to get revenge, which is just very futile. They're trying to stop people informing, they're trying to scare people, they're trying to intimidate, they're trying to enforce control over territory in which they operate. This is what makes our gang problem like an insurgency problem. And I don't mean to be, I know some people say I'm being hyperbolic. I'm going to explain why I'm not being hyperbolic. I think people think I'm being hyperbolic because they have a skewed view of what an insurgency looks like. Most of the deaths when countries experience an insurgency or a civil war, most of the deaths in an insurgency are not due to one side shooting the other side. They're the result of insurgent groups and sometimes governments trying to maintain order within their own territory that they control. So a lot of the violent deaths in an insurgency looks a lot like murder, and just general phrase of murder. And it's insurgent groups trying to maintain control of their territory, prevent defection to the other side, and just like maintain a sense of order so that they can carry out their operations. If you were to map a kind of graph, the ontology of violence and insurgency, an ontology of the violence as in a country with lots of gangs, you'd see that they map onto pretty similarly. And if you still don't believe me, overcrowding and lack of infrastructure in Kingston. Now, these communities have become safe havens for these gangs. Kilcullen refers to them as peri-urban because they're not a part of the life of the regular city. They exist in a kind of in-between state. And you and I experience this every day because I grew up in Jamaica. I had barely visited one of these communities, and honestly, I was involved in some kind of charity or work or something. You can spend your whole life in Jamaica and almost never visit one of these, in Kingston and never visit one of these communities. They're not a part of the life of the regular city. As Dr. McCann pointed out, I believe that police don't have a lot of control over these areas. They're completely captive to criminal elements. Now, another reason why they're semi-isolated is because it's not just that they can't leave, people can't leave, it's that they don't leave as a matter of practicality. I mean, you have 7 generations of one family living in the same house, in the same community. Not at the same time, obviously, but over time. And can any of us imagine living in the same house as our great-great-great-grandmother? It's unusual. These populations are captive there, in effect. And the continued existence of these communities and letting these populations remain captive is what allows these gangs to have these safe havens. And the amount of safe havens that exist across the island is what allows for the proliferation and the continued existence of these gangs. And as long as we have hospital environments for these gangs, we will have a murder problem because murders are the homicidal behavior was a function of the proliferation of gangs, and the proliferation of gangs is a function of the existence of these safe havens, these communities as safe havens. And so if you want to, I disagree with Dr. Michael and some of the people of it, there is in fact a short-term solution to this. It is to undo or to break down the barriers that exist between that prevent these communities from integrating into the regular life of the city, the regular economy. And those barriers include things like lack of land tenure, and lack of infrastructure that makes you and I not want to buy into these communities, and or not able to buy into these communities because we couldn't get the title for the land down there. And break these civil barriers, which are included as a part of the ZOZO program. And the ZOZO, by the way, Claire Hona built, as my friend here pointed out, is also based on counterinsurgency theory for this reason, in recognition that our problem is like an insurgency. But if we break down these barriers, we can, in short term, integrate these communities into the life of the regular socio-economic life, and we'll deny these violent organizations safe havens from here on out.
Thank you very much, Mr. Caldwell. We are going to go straight into the Q&A. Before I start asking my questions, I'm going to open up the floor, the audience, if anybody wants. I see one hand. There are mics to either side of the aisle behind you, Diana. Dr. Thorburn, you have the first question, please.
Okay, thank you. Diana Thorburn, Director of Research at the Caribbean Policy Research Institute. Quickly, I want to congratulate Ronaldo on bringing this together. I think it's a really important discussion for us to be having, the symposium in general, and this in particular, because I think that for all of us operating in the citizen security space, for want of a better way of calling it, are trying to grapple with this distinction between what is crime and what is violence. And I think everybody here kind of talked towards it or around it. I heard Lloyd saying that in CMOC they were grappling with separating crime and violence and corruption. I heard Mr. Caldwell say that he wants to call it homicidal behavior, but I don't get the sense that we are really clear on where those lines are drawn and how do we use those lines in thinking about better policy programs, strategies, whether it's policing strategy or interventions targeting at-risk youth or urban design, if we're going to go along the lines of what Mr. Caldwell said. And so I wanted to hear from everybody really more about what that delineation actually means. You know, we called it a discursive shift, but what it really means for policy. And I think we can all acknowledge that there has been a discursive shift. Everybody spoke to that. But what does it really mean? And just before I go, I have to say, Lloyd, this issue of electricity theft resolving that, it's actually not a far-fetched idea and something Capri is working on right now.
Okay, I'm going to give each panelist 30 to 45 seconds to respond to Dr. Thorburns' questions so we can take some more questions from the audience.
All right, so yeah. I wonder if there's a politician in the room. Right. Okay. So that's a good point. Where does one end and where does the other one begin? So a feature of it and how it impacts what we do is that we know for sure that one of the biggest indicators of a murder that's going to take place or a shooting is that there's been a previous one. And the closer that is to somebody who is related to that person, most recently, we just had a problem in Spanish Town, and we have a situation there where gangs are fighting. Criminals are actually at war with each other. One of their mothers got killed. So another mother got killed. And then a cousin got killed. And a father got killed. And when that starts to happen, then you're in a situation where you're unlikely. So police action of the traditional sense, i.e. occupation, arrest, and so on, delays the follow-on act of violence. It usually doesn't prevent it. So what we do as a force is that we have a proactive violence interruption strategy. We have an early attribution strategy that indicates that as early as possible after the violent act has occurred, we want to know who did it, get a sense of why it happened, why the conflict is there. And we have persons who are violence interrupters and actually go into these situations to try and bring the temperature down. It also means that from time to time, it means that you have to do, and that's where you actually, the value of things like pre-charge detention and where things take place, cooling off people, because they will want to kill when certain things happen. So there are not only policies, but there is a recognition that this is how the violence works and how it will spin out if you don't interrupt it. Now, normally in a community, ultimately, when there are no cameras, when there are no other people there, the communities that are not part of the city, as was discussed earlier, we are there, the police are there. So we are the first responders, and we are the ones who respond. So we have to provide services that are not just traditional policing services, but we go into all the other services. That's actually, it's that recognition, 76% gang, 14% interpersonal, 6% in pursuit of other crimes, 1% mob killings, and about 5 that usually remain undetermined. That's how it splits up. And obviously the responses has to interrupt that 76% first. The interpersonal, that is beyond just domestic, but interpersonal violence accounts for a big 14% chunk of that. It causes us to do things like put in domestic violence centers at our stations to deal with these things, train people on these things. So it's a comprehensive approach. So you have this broad comprehensive approach that was spoken about, but even within the organization, you have a comprehensive approach of doing things not in oars, but in ands.
I think we can properly distinguish the cultural drivers and separate that in defining the violence problem generally and finding solutions. I think that in terms of the crime problem, criminal violence problem, which is a particular subset, what I have found probably an oversimplification is two things. First of all, the designation of gangs and inter-gang often confuses in the mental picture that we create between what you might call primary group associations between individuals, groups in communities, and what is in effect organized criminal enterprise. Now, some of these enterprises are huge enterprises. We have some before the courts now, and we know of them in the past. And others are burgeoning, nascent enterprises, and often those in formation tend to be more violent because they are less established. But in both cases, I think we need to focus on the individuals. The most effective deterrent that I have seen is identifying the person who is involved in the violence, mounting a proper investigation to be able to bring them before the criminal justice system, the courts, and taking them out of circulation and cutting off the income that keeps spawning these enterprises. Now, but there's another reason to look at the individuals, because some of the work that I have seen from Herbert Gale points out that you have a relatively small number of people that are responsible for multiple murders, and that implies some kind of psychological malfunction that is taking place. And he has identified some of the driving elements, the absence of a father figure in some of these, and more than that, the abandonment by mother, he says, is the critical factor in this. But you have individuals responsible for 10 and more murders. If you take them out, and the term is not meant to make bloodlust. It is really meant to take them out of circulation in normal society. If you do that, you are making a huge contribution. But even more, if you can identify those predisposed to that behavior before they, in fact, become involved in such behavior and have the mental health and other interventions in schools, then you can get ahead of the problem also. But identify those causing the problem. Modern policing it was like a mantra. Modern policing is intelligence-driven policing.
Okay, thank you. Dr. Mackay?
If I'm to understand the question, it's really the separation between the analysis of violence versus crime in general. That was what I was getting from it. And how do they coexist with one reducing, one increasing? As I said earlier, it comes down to proximity and logics. You can secure a high traffic zone, a high commercial zone, create resources in that area, human and otherwise, that create some degree of barriers to crimes being committed. However, and you will find at that point a reduction in certain crimes, robberies and so on and so forth. You'll notice in COVID that there were drops in break-ins and sexual offences and so on also, simply because everybody was contained at home. So it's harder to rape in an environment like that because there's more persons collectively together, and as well as there's people home, so you're going to have less breaking. There's less people in public spaces, you're going to have less robberies. It didn't really help us that much in murders, largely because these guys don't have to kill very far from home, and the curfews in effect were arterial. They stopped movement on the roads and so on, so you found that persons leaving the community to commit crimes otherwise was restricted, but the ability for them to go over 3 or 4 zinc fences and attack a neighboring community or a neighboring lane, because they're very, very close, it really wasn't impacted by it. So again, yes, there is a big cultural issue that persons would choose violence as their primary control or their primary method to deal with conflicts, but it is also a logical issue as well. It's very easy to do. A lot of the victims are criminals themselves, and the average person is less likely to get involved in the judicial process if he thinks that the victim is somebody who had it coming, to put it quite loosely. So how you can divide it is you look on violent crime and look on how it takes place. So if you're having homicides that are taking place as a result of robbery, it's a different analysis than if you have homicides taking place as intra-gang conflicts and in very small zones. I hope that may answer your question in some way. Thanks.
I think, like Dr. Mackay, I tried to go through my mind to ensure let's go back through the questions to ensure I understood what you were asking. And so for me, it actually started with coming to a common definition of violence. So crime is crime, and we can look at that in the broadest context. Not all corruption, not all robberies are necessarily violent. But by definition, we can say homicides, shootings, rapes, but then we now need to be able to start capturing data like a robbery that where the person utilized some type of violence, attempted murders as an example. So once you come to that common definition and are able to gather the data, then the targeting of the programs will come a lot easier. I would have to say, from what I have seen, there are very specific programs and activities across several organizations that are targeted at dealing with the issue of violence. The Commissioner mentioned a few, and I got to, having had many of these conversations with him and his team, I have to certainly commend the approaches that they're taking, because they're taking it from a number of different elements. As you get into the work of the Minister of Culture, Gender, Entertainment and Sports, when they're dealing with the National Strategic Action Plan against gender-based violence, they're very clear on the different types of, there's much clarity on the different types of interventions that are required. So from the perspective of the question, that common definition, the ability to gather the data and then to have targeted programs attending to it, and whether some of that is policy and legislative, and whether some of that is whether it's a non-governmental organization or the JCF or a ministry, just to ensure that they're very targeted in their approaches.
Sorry. So the discoursive distinction between crime and violence is, I think it's very important, because it gets to the heart of what government is. You will always have crime, and crime will always evolve. Yesterday we had drug trafficking, tomorrow was scamming. It's always have various people always find a way to subvert the law, all that kind of stuff. With violence, it gets to the core of what government is. As to borrow from my friend Max Weber, governments, one of the government's first duties is to establish the legitimate monopoly on violence. Government is violence. So when we talk about Jamaica has a violence problem, we're talking about We're talking about people competing and undermining the government's legitimate claims to the use on the monopoly on violence. It's a discussion above what run-of-the-mill criminology deals with. We're coming into the realm of strategy. How do we compete for space that is being claimed by illegitimate violence producers? We're talking about, we get into logic of deterrence, of denying the enemy comfort and resources. It's more of a strategic competition now than just run-of-the-mill law enforcement. Run-of-the-mill law enforcement is not to underplay the importance of law enforcement, of course. But it's a level above that we talk, because strategy comes at the political level. So governments have to decide now how they want to handle space that is being controlled by groups that are essentially trying to provide their own forms of government. And that's the conversation to have. And that is why the establishment of the Zozo law is a watershed moment, because now it kind of formalizes the military's role in dealing with this major problem by bringing them in a formal way, whereas before they were just supplying support to law enforcement. Now they're actively a part of dealing with these, how do you want to call it, rogue territories, or so that exist in our midst. That's what the distinction needs to be. But again, just can I add on to that? Why, even though I said refer to cited Weber and governments being having a monopoly on the legitimate use of violence, I still prefer to use the term homicidal behavior, because using the term violence generally, I think it kind of, it doesn't capture instances of violence, like, robbery to me is violence, rape is violence, and those things are trending downwards, and so it's me, and so more probably those in the realm of crime. So, but also it kind of, use of violence kind of ends up supporting or seeming to support or allowing for one of these folk theories about how low levels of violence lead to are the building blocks on which homicidal behavior is. Like, for example, so preventing ways from fighting each other in schools is somehow going to undermine a general culture of violence that's going to bring down the murder rates. Those are two different phenomena. They're not connected I've seen no indication they're connected in the slices. So yeah, I'll end there.
Thank you. Mr. Levy, you have a question?
I would like to thank Senor Reynaldo Ortiz very, very much. And so much richness to really make one want to comment on several issues. I'm going to concentrate just particularly on the last one by Alex Coswell, a very, very challenging comment of his. But I want to focus very briefly just on what the first panelist, Commissioner Tony Anderson, raised, because he brought forward an extremely important historical point, which is the introduction of security into the IMF's agreement with us. Because what that has led to, as he points out, is the central importance of the kind of security that we have focused on. And what this has meant is the shunting aside, the displacement and this is a key thing, of family security, food security, health security, educational security. These have all been replaced now by the physical security of what Lloyd has called the crime justice connection, where the police or the military arrest you, it goes to the courts, it goes to the correctional services, that whole set of things. Is this something we want? The source of it, one can inquire into, or the sources. Clearly, there's an international source, it's the IMF that brought it in, but there's more than that. That the wars which have preoccupied this century so much. We have one going on right now in Europe, but there are others preceding that in Afghanistan, Iraq, and so on. So wars have taken over, and violence of that sort, extremely important internationally. Is that what's the source of our preoccupation with the kind of security, the displacing security that we're focused on? I don't know, I raise it. I find it extremely undesirable to have security that displaces these other areas of family, health, education, and so on.
Sure, go ahead, Commissioner. You want to respond to that?
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Levy. So, I mentioned about the policy shift that put security central as not only a driver of improved economic life, developmental life, and so on. But I made the point that what flowed from that was a plan called Plan Secure Jamaica, which actually seeks to protect all of the sectors that you just spoke about. So health security is one of them, the security of our financial sector, and therefore it starts to deal with matters like the cyber attacks and how you develop the resilience, the cyber resilience of a country. It talks about how you protect your blue economy and therefore the livelihood of the people. And it's a comprehensive view of security that now involves all ministries, not just as policing to target criminals, but as a broader sense of security. From that now flows the aspect of that comes under the Ministry of National Security that has to respond to the actual deaths, and this is not the actual deaths of Jamaican citizens for the last decades who have died at the hands of particular people, murderers, who have been killing our people non-stop for over 1,000 a year, that need a certain amount of focus on them, or that killing will not stop. And so it is to actually defund or to remove or not fund law enforcement in that context would be a very big mistake, and it's a mistake that we have paid the price for over time, and a significant price in lives. And interesting, just quickly, a quick comment. Alex spoke about the zone of special operations, and I'm going to briefly, just very quickly, talk about the state of public emergency, because that is a very topical thing. So what occurs in that, in real life, is that all violence goes down when you impose it. Not only criminal violence, but the violence of the police force or the military. All forms of violence reduce. And that is what the numbers say, that's what the statistics show. And it happened the first time one was imposed, we got a 72%, 240 less people died in St. James. These are the actual numbers. 240 less people died in St. James, and there was a 22% reduction overall in the country. this is what happened. So, and it happened in an environment where less violence occurred, less police shootings, and certainly less criminal shootings, and communities felt safer, and every survey was done suggests that they wanted it.
Sorry, Ms. Lee. Go ahead.
are replaced by what the police can do, what the military can do, and they can't do all the things that are really needed to be done. And so there is and then when you look at the amount of finances, the increased budget to the Ministry of National Security compared to which has taken place over years, to the budget that should have been going into the courts and to the court system, into correctional services, into education, into improving family life. All these have suffered as a result of the heavy financing that's gone into one sector.
Well, I don't agree with that. They're ours. I think we need to do ands to get this system going. Not only does that investment need to take place in there, but downstream, certainly in the courts, I agree with you, and in corrections, we need to reduce the recidivism of 40+% that we have now. Otherwise, the problem just keeps coming back on us. So I will agree with you that the expenditure needs to be broader, but when I speak about the expenditure on security, it can't just be on police. It is on the criminal justice system as one aspect of it. And of course, I mean, there's a lot of funding that goes into communities, but the idea of the community not being involved, and I think we have a panel coming up where I have Senior Superintendent Ellis, who's here, right there, and he did some really interesting things within the pandemic, but also as police and community that has spawned a lot of interest and support from the private sector across the country. So he'll be speaking about that when it comes to the pandemic.
Thank you very much, Commissioner. I am going to apologize to panel number 2. We are slightly running over due to the late start, so I am taking 5 extra minutes from your panel. As a moderator for that panel, I'm pulling moderator privileges and just stealing 5 minutes. I see Nadia is standing up. Nadia, you have a question?
It was a really quick question, but it's almost provocations to different points that were raised, so we don't have to cover it right now. Dr. Nadia Figueroa, thank you so much for the level of stimulation and thought that you've given us. I have things that were just buzzing around in the back of the mind that I wanted to throw out there. One would start actually with Peter Phillips, the cultural revolution that's required, and addressing corruption, the kind of campaign that's required to move the needle on corruption. Where do you see leadership and strategies for that sitting? I felt there were lots of nodding in the audience when you talked about the fact that there's something historically about how violence has played out in our culture as far as how we view ourselves, in our relationships, our power dynamics, and absolutely in our institutions, beginning with the political parties. Any kind of holistic response has to deal with that. But when you talk about culture and how diffuse it is, where is that being driven strategically but also people-wise? I think also Lloyd Distant would have fantastic kind of input on that. Mr. Carswell, I have to, on the reference you made to what is the connection, there isn't much between maybe the intervention, say, with schools and young men and violent activity there, and then what we're seeing with gang criminality, and really needing to focus on deterrence and just being kind of focused on that. I guess my challenge is I can easily see a situation in which we get brilliant at deterrence, but if the conditions, if the factory that is producing the producers is still going strong, that are we in a constant cycle of becoming more and more excellent at deterrence, but not dealing with conditions. Which brings me back to Major General, because I think you said in your opening, I really felt that it's going to be a combinational response. And in Mr. Levy's kind of provocation, what I feel there is so much of when we talk about securitization, you know, we have the whole stabilization of the economy movement, we're living it. Now we have securitization of our society movement, we're living it. JCF, JDF, pivotal in that. Ministry of National Security, pivotal in that. It took the IMF to prod for us to put that into the higher level national thinking and planning. But as you have said, it is not the JCF alone. It is not a one ministry alone. How are we getting to the place where we're talking more about thriving communities with security as we have more narrowly seen it being core to that, but all the other elements of security being essential? And when we talk about the trust, respect between police and community, we're making such progress we have further to go. Where is that sitting? Where is the vision and the leadership for the joined up, holistic, all of society approach when we talk about thriving communities which do not have violence producers, but where there is the educational attainment, the health access, and I'm putting it to you because you've been put in this leadership position and you're saying it's not just the police. But, you know, there's a way in which it has been put on formal national security when, of course, it's a bigger conversation. So I know we can't cover all of that, but it felt like those were really interesting provocations that came out. Thank you.
Unfortunately, we are running a little over, so there's a lot of room for discussion. I think we could sit down here all day debating this issue. However, I am going to have to cut this short so that we can accommodate and make sure the rest of the panels go on time, because we are utilizing people's times and we don't want to assume that they're free after this. So I want to thank the panelists, Major General Anderson, Dr. Phillips, Dr. Mackay, Mr. Distance, and Mr. Coswell. I want to thank you for participating in this panel. And panelist number 2, I'm going to ask you to just stand by in their interim. Thank you very much.